The deafening crash of thunder made Abigail Mason tighten her grip on her horse's reins. The merciless rain lashed her face as she tried in vain to find some shelter in the dark expanse of Redemption Creek. The thick drops quickly turned the red earth into mud, and her previously impeccable navy blue dress was now soaked and dirty. He had left Silver Junction too late, ignoring the coachman's warnings about the approaching storm. But she had no choice. Her position as the new teacher at Redemption Creek School would begin in 2 days, and she still needed to organize the small house the town had provided for her. A new flash briefly illuminated the landscape, revealing a solitary building on the horizon. Without thinking twice, Abigail directed her horse there. As he got closer, he made out the outlines of a wooden hut, apparently abandoned. The windows were dark, and one of the porch boards was swaying dangerously in the wind. Dismounting with difficulty, Abigail led her horse to the makeshift shelter next to the cabin. His hand shook as he tried to tie the reins, partly from the cold, partly from fear. The 22-year-old had never found herself in such a precarious situation. Since leaving Boston fleeing a past she would rather forget. The cabin door wasn't locked, creaking softly as she pushed it open. The interior was in darkness, lit only by the occasional flash of lightning. Abigail took a match from her sodden coat pocket, lighting it with trembling fingers. The small flame revealed a modest but tidy environment, a table with 2 chairs, some cupboards, and a door that probably led to a bedroom. Exhausted and soaked to the bone, Abigail crossed the main room. He needed to find something dry to keep warm, or he would end up sick before he even started his new job. The room was small, dominated by a simple bed covered with a brown woolen blanket. On a chair in the corner he identified some folded articles of clothing. "Forgive me, whoever owns it," she muttered to herself, reaching for a clean shirt. He quickly changed his wet clothes, hanging them on the chair to dry. The tiredness of the IB journey was beginning to take its toll on his muscles, and the bed seemed irresistibly inviting. "Just a few minutes," she promised herself, lying down on the blanket. The sound of rain on the roof soon lulled her into a deep sleep. What Abigail didn't know was that the cabin belonged to Jesse Mason, one of the territory's most wanted outlaws. Known for leading the infamous band of Mason brothers, Jesse carried a $5,000 bounty on his head, dead or alive. That same night, he returned from a failed stagecoach robbery, his mood as stormy as the sky above. When Jesse entered his cabin hours later, the first thing he noticed were the wet footprints on the wooden floor. His instincts, honed by years of living outside the law, immediately put him on alert. With his hand on the revolver, he moved silently to his room. The sight he encountered left him momentarily unresponsive. A woman slept in his bed wearing one of his shirts. His dark brown hair spread across the pillow like a fan, and his breathing was smooth and even. The wet clothes hanging on the chair told the story of how she got there. Jesse should wake her up, kick her out. It was what any sensible man would do. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the serene expression on his face, so different from the looks of fear or contempt he was used to receiving. Or perhaps it was simply exhaustion from years of living in constant vigilance. Silently he retreated to the main room, settling in one of the chairs. For the first time in a long time, his cabin didn't feel so empty and cold. Dawn brought with it the first rays of sunlight and birdsong. Abigail woke up, slowly taking a few seconds to remember where she was. When the realization hit her, she sat up abruptly on the bed. The sound of movement in the next room made his heart race. He got up carefully, quickly, putting on his now dry clothes. I needed to get out of there before the cabin owner woke up. But when he opened the bedroom door, he found Jesse Mason sitting at the table, calmly cleaning his revolver. Recognition was instantaneous. Wanted posters with his face were scattered throughout the territory. Abigail felt her blood run cold in her veins. Jesse looked up at her, and for a moment that seemed like an eternity, their eyes met. "Good morning, miss," he said in a surprisingly gentle voice. "Coffee's ready if you want." But Abigail was already running for the door. Within seconds, she was on her horse, galloping toward Redemption Creek, as if the devil himself was chasing her. The sound of his horse's hooves mixed with the rapid beat of his heart. Jessie stood in the doorway of her cabin, watching her leave. A sad smile played on his lips as the morning sun illuminated his features, marked by time and hard life. That night had been unlike any other. For the first time in years, he had slept without the constant company of his inner demons. What he didn't know was that that chance meeting would forever change the course of their lives. In Redemption Creek, a new story was about to begin, intertwining the fates of an outlaw seeking redemption and a teacher carrying secrets of her own. And so, as the sun rose over the western plains, a journey began that would test the limits of love, courage, and the possibility of redemption. Abigail's arrival at Redemption Creek did not go unnoticed. The small town with its dusty streets and faded wooden houses rarely welcomed new residents, much less a teacher from the east. As she crossed the main street, still shaky from her encounter at the cabin, she noticed the curious looks of the local residents. The school was a modest one-story building painted white with a small bell on top. Next door, a smaller building would serve as his residence for the next few months. Abigail dismounted her legs, still wobbly from the frantic riding. "Miss Mason!" a deep voice called her. Sheriff Richard Henderson, a middle-aged man with graying hair and kind eyes, approached with a warm smile. "We were starting to worry. Yesterday's storm. I found shelter on the way," Abigail replied quickly, avoiding his eyes. The mere thought of last night made his heart race. "Is the house ready?" "Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Murphy left everything organized. She even prepared a meal for your arrival. Beat." As the sheriff helped her with her luggage, Abigail struggled to maintain her composure. Every sudden sound made her jump, fearing that Jesse Mason would appear at any moment. But how could he explain to the sheriff that he had slept in the Pike cabin of the region's most wanted criminal? The house was simple, but welcoming, with basic furniture and flowery curtains on the windows. In the kitchen he found a note from Mrs. Murphy, along with some still-warm stew. Abigail forced herself to eat, even though she had no appetite, knowing that she would need the strength to face her first day of school tomorrow. At night, lying in her new bed, she couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Jesse Mason's face, not the menacing face on the wanted posters, but the serene expression with which he had watched her that morning. Why hadn't he hurt her? Why did he offer coffee sleep when it finally came, brought with it nightmares of his own past in Boston? The accusations, the scornful looks, the shame that had forced her to flee to the West. "You're not better than him," a voice whispered in his mind. "There's blood on your hands, too." The next morning Abigail woke up, determined to bury the memories of the night in the cabin. She wore her best light blue dress and tied her hair into an impeccable bun. School was waiting for her, and with it, the chance to start over. 15 students of different ages were eagerly awaiting their first class. Among them was Mary Henderson, the sheriff's 12-year-old daughter with bright eyes and golden braids. Abigail began the lesson with a forced smile, trying to ignore the fear that still coursed through her veins. But fate had other plans. During lunch break, while the children were playing in the courtyard, Abigail heard a commotion coming from the street. He walked to the window in time to see 3 knights arriving at the city. His blood ran cold as he recognized the Mason brothers, but Jesse was not among them. "We are looking for our brother," announced the eldest William Mason, his voice carrying a veiled threat. "Has anyone seen him around these parts?" Sheriff Henderson faced the outlaws with calculated calm. "We haven't heard from Jesse Mason around here. I suggest you keep looking elsewhere." Abigail watched the scene with her heart in her throat. The Mason brothers had the same hard expression as Jesse, but without that glimmer of kindness that she had glimpsed in their eyes. They were dangerous men, known for leaving no witnesses. When the knights finally left, Abigail noticed that her hands were shaking. What would happen if they found out she had been with Jesse? More important, why had he separated from his brothers? At night alone in her house, Abigail was trying to correct her students' first exercises when she heard a noise on the back porch. His first instinct was to reach for the small pistol he kept hidden in his drawer, a souvenir from Boston that he hoped he would never need to use again. "Don't shoot," said a familiar voice from the other side of the door. "I just want to talk." Jesse Mason stood on his porch unarmed, with his hands raised in surrender. His expression was serious, but his eyes, there was something different about them. "Go away," Abigail whispered, the pistol shaking in her hands, "or I'll scream." "Your brothers were here today," he said, ignoring the threat. "I'm moving away from them, from the life I used to lead." "Why?" Jesse took a step forward, still keeping his hands visible. "Because that night. It was the first time in years that I felt at peace. I came to tell you that you don't need to. Be afraid of me." Abigail felt tears welling up in her eyes. "You don't know what you're talking about. You don't know me." "Then let me know," he replied softly. "Everyone deserves a second chance, even the two of us." Before Abigail could respond, they heard voices approaching the sheriff's night patrol. When she turned back to the door, Jesse had already disappeared into the darkness. That night, Abigail cried herself to sleep, her tears staining the ungraded exercises. In her dreams, images of Boston, of the blood on her hands, and of Jesse Mason's eyes mingled, eyes that, like hers, carried the weight of irreversible choices. The next morning, when he opened his door, he found a single wild flower on the doormat. She was a lily of the desert, as resilient as she was beautiful, like the hope of redemption that against all logic was beginning to blossom in her heart. The days that followed at Redemption Creek brought a seemingly peaceful routine for Abigail. His mornings were dedicated to teaching, watching his students' progress with satisfaction. The afternoons were filled with class preparations and occasional visits from parents who little by little began to trust the new teacher coming from the East. But the nights were different. Every creaking of boards, every shadow cast by the moonlight made his heart race. Since Jesse's unexpected visit, Abigail had been in a constant state of alert. The desert lily he had left behind had withered days ago, but its presence still lingered like a ghost in his mind. One particularly hot afternoon while organizing the classroom after the students left, Abigail heard a commotion coming from the main street. A sizable group of people gathered in front of the Henderson Sheriff's office. In the center of the crowd, a bloodied man was carried inside. "It was one of the Mason brothers," someone shouted. "William Mason is dead." Abigail's blood ran cold in her veins. He approached discreetly, staying in the shadows of the school porch. Sheriff Henderson emerged from the office, his face grave. "William Mason was found dead near the creek," he announced. "He was shot in the back. Whoever did it. It wasn't a fair duel." The crowd's murmurs grew louder. Some speculated about a dispute between rival gangs. Others suspected betrayal within the Mason family itself. Abigail, however, felt a terrible weight on her chest. Could it be possible that Jesse, Miss Mason? Mary Henderson's soft voice surprised her. The girl had stayed to help her with organizing the library. "Are you okay? You look pale." "I'm fine, honey," Abigail lied, forcing a smile. "Why don't you go home? It's getting late." After Mary left, Abigail locked the school, and walked quickly to her house. Night was falling, painting the sky with shades of purple and crimson. The streets were starting to empty, but she felt eyes everywhere. When he got home, he immediately noticed that something was different. The back door was unlocked, although he was sure he had closed it in the morning. With his heart pounding, he slowly pushed the door open. Jesse Mason sat at his kitchen table, a makeshift bandage on his left arm. His eyes, normally steady, seemed troubled. "It wasn't me," he said before she could speak. "William. He was my brother. I would never shoot in the back." Abigail closed the door quietly behind her. "Why are you here? It's dangerous." "The others will think it was me," Jesse continued, his voice full of bitterness. "James and Robert will never believe that I didn't kill our brother. I needed at least one person to know the truth." "Why me?" Jesse scrambled to his feet, revealing more blood on his shirt. "Because you carry secrets too, don't you? I see it in your eyes." The same fear, the same guilt. The words hit Abigail like a punch. The memories of Boston, which he was fighting so hard to suppress, came flooding back in full force. The pale face of her fiancé Charles slumped on the marble stairs, the blood on his hands. Not literal, but equally unwashable. "You don't know anything about me," she whispered, but her voice betrayed her vulnerability. "I know you're running away just like me," Jesse replied, approaching. "And I know that night at the cabin meant something to you, too. Why else would you still be here listening to me instead of calling the sheriff?" Abigail felt tears burning her eyes. "I need you to leave. I can't get involved in this. I have a chance to start over here." "What if I'm also looking for a fresh start?" Jesse's voice was almost a plea. "What if William's death is a sign that we need to change our lives?" Before Abigail could respond, they heard voices approaching. Jesse quickly moved to the back window, but stopped for a moment. "There will be an investigation," he said. "When they find out it wasn't me, they'll come after the real killer. Stay alert, Abigail. Something bigger is happening at Redemption Creek." With those words, he disappeared into the darkness, leaving Abigail alone, with her turbulent thoughts. Minutes later, when Sheriff Henderson knocked on her door to ask if she had noticed anything suspicious, she lied with a casualness that scared her. That night, lying in her bed, Abigail realized that she was hopelessly caught up in the unfolding web of events. William Mason's murder. Jesse's secrets, her own dark past, everything was beginning to intertwine in a way that terrified her. And yet in the midst of the fear and uncertainty, a part of her yearned for her next meeting with Jesse. There was something, in his eyes, a mutual understanding of pain and the search for redemption that drew her inexorably. The desert wind blew through the cracks in her window, bringing with it the distant howl of a coyote. In Redemption, Creek secrets were beginning to emerge from the shadows, threatening to destroy the fragile hopes of a new beginning. William Mason's death shook Redemption Creek like a desert gale. In the days that followed, the small town was buzzing with rumors and speculation. Sheriff Henderson redoubled patrols, and posters offering a reward for the killer began appearing on every street corner. Abigail tried to maintain her normal routine, but every time she came across one of the posters, her stomach twisted. Jesse's words about something bigger happening at Redemption Creek haunted her. During class, he found himself peering out the window more often, as if he expected to see some hidden threat emerging from the shadows. On a particularly tense afternoon, Mrs. Murphy, wife of the local grocery store owner, showed up at the school after classes. She was a plump lady with cunning eyes that seemed to see right through people. "Miss Mason," She began straightening her shawl. "I must tell you something I saw the night of the murder." Abigail felt her heart speed up. "What's this about Mrs. Murphy?" "I saw two men talking to William Mason in the saloon that afternoon. They weren't from around here, and one of them, well, had a Pinkerton badge hidden under his coat." The revelation hit Abigail like a bolt of lightning. The Pinkerton Agency, the same detectives who had investigated Charles's death in Boston. Was it possible that her past had finally caught up with her? "Did you tell the sheriff about this?" he asked, struggling to keep his voice steady. "Not yet, darling. Something told me to talk to you first." Mrs. Murphy leaned in closer. "You know, I've lived long enough to recognize when someone carries a heavy burden. And your eyes, well, they're the same ones I've seen in the mirror since I lost my first husband in the war." Abigail felt tears forming. "Mrs. Murphy, You don't have to tell me anything, sweetie. I just thought you should know. Be careful." After Mrs. Murphy left, Abigail locked the school with shaking hands. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and red that resembled blood. As he walked home, his mind swirled with terrifying possibilities. When he got home, he found another desert lily on his porch. Her heart skipped a beat. Jessie was nearby. As if responding to his thoughts, a shadow moved from the back of his house. "We need to talk," Jessie said, emerging from the darkness. There was urgency in his voice. "Is it about the Pinkerton men?" Abigail asked, surprising him. Jessie frowned. "How do you know about them?" Abigail hesitated, but realized she could no longer keep her secrets. He invited him in, and for the first time since arriving, West began to tell his story. "In Boston, I was engaged to Charles Worthington, son of an important banker." Her voice trembled slightly. "He was not the man he appeared to be. One night, I discovered that he was involved in a scheme to rob his own bank using my name to embezzle funds." Jessie listened intently, his eyes fixed on her. "What happened?" "I confronted him. There was an argument at the top of the marble staircase. He tried to attack me and—" Abigail closed her eyes, reliving the moment. "He fell. Pinkerton detectives were hired to investigate, but they never found enough evidence against me. I still had to escape." A heavy silence filled the room. Jessie finally spoke. "William found out something about a bigger scheme involving Eastern banks. He talked about it the night before he died. Do you think there's a connection?" "I don't believe in coincidences," Jessie replied. "William mentioned a name, Worthington." Abigail felt her blood run cold in her veins. "Charles's father. The same men who killed you must be after you now," Jessie said, his voice thick with concern. "We need to find out what's going on before it's too late." At that moment, they heard approaching voices, the night patrol. Jessie quickly moved to the back door, but before leaving he grabbed Abigail's hand. "You're not alone in this anymore," he whispered. "I promise I will protect you." After he left, Abigail lay awake for hours, going over everything in her mind. The pieces of the puzzle began to fit together, forming a frightening image. The past he had tried to leave behind in Boston had become intertwined with the mysteries of Redemption Creek in ways he never could have imagined. The next morning, when Abigail opened the school door, she noticed an envelope lying on the floor. Inside was a single sheet of paper with words cut from newspapers. "We know who you are. We know what you did." The desert wind was blowing stronger that morning, carrying with it the weight of long-buried secrets and the promise of a storm to come. In Redemption Creek, the shadows of past and present began to merge, threatening to swallow everyone in their path. The anonymous threat found at the school door changed everything for Abigail. Every shadow seemed to hide an enemy, Every unfamiliar face could belong to a Pinkerton detective. Still, she refused to abandon her students. School had become her refuge, the only place where she could pretend her life wasn't falling apart. One particularly hot morning, while writing exercises on the blackboard, Abigail noticed unusual movement on the street. Two well-dressed men, clearly not from Redemption Creek, were talking to Sheriff Henderson. His heart sank when he recognized one of them, Daniel Preston, one of the detectives who had investigated Charles's death in Boston. "Miss Mason," Mary Henderson's voice brought her back to reality. "Are you okay? Your hands are shaking." Abigail forced a smile. "I'm fine, honey. Just a little tired." He turned back to the class, trying to maintain his composure. "Let's take an early lunch break today." After the children left, Abigail remained at the school watching through the window. The men were gone, but their presence had left a trail of fear that she couldn't ignore. He needed to find Jesse, warn him about the detectives. As if answering his thoughts, he found a folded note under his door when he returned home at dusk. "Abandoned. Thompson Barn, midnight. I discovered something important. J." The barn was half a kilometer from town, a solitary structure that stood out against the starry sky when Abigail arrived, mounted on her horse. Jesse was already waiting for her, his silhouette silhouetted against the dim light of a lamp. "Ah, Pinkertons are here," she said, without preamble, dismounting. "I know," Jesse replied, his face tense in the flickering light. "But there is more. Much more." He took out some papers from his coat pocket. "I found this among William's things. They are documents about a scheme involving several Eastern banks. The name of the Worthington Bank appears several times." Abigail looked through the papers with shaking hands. "Charles was involved in something much bigger than I imagined. His father, Benjamin Worthington, is using smaller banks to launder money from illegal operations," Jesse explained. "William found out and tried to blackmail him. That's why they killed him. And now the Pinkertons are here to clear any connection with the Worthingtons." Abigail concluded, feeling a shiver run down her spine. Jesse approached, his eyes locked on hers. "I won't let them hurt you." "Why?" she asked, her voice just a whisper. "Why do you care so much?" "Because ever since that night in the cabin, I haven't been able to stop thinking about you," he confessed. "How you slept so peacefully, trusting without knowing. No one has ever trusted me like that." The moment was interrupted by the sounds of approaching hooves. Jesse quickly turned off the lamp, pulling Abigail into the shadows. 3 horsemen passed near the barn. They were James and Robert Mason, accompanied by one of the well-dressed men Abigail had seen earlier. "Your brothers are working with the Pinkertons," she whispered, horrified. "They probably made a deal to hand me over in exchange for immunity," Jesse replied, his voice bitter. "The Mason family has always been good at betrayal." When the knights walked away, Jesse cupped Abigail's face in his hands. "I need you to trust me now. I have a plan, but it's risky. Which I will use William's documents to negotiate with Benjamin Worthington. In exchange for our safety, we hand over the evidence." Abigail shook her head. "It's suicide. He'll never leave witnesses alive. So what's the alternative? Keep running forever?" Before she could respond, they heard more horses approaching. This time, it was Sheriff Henderson's patrol. "Go," whispered Abigail. "We'll meet tomorrow night, same time at the creek where William was killed. Maybe I'll have a better idea by then." Jesse hesitated for a moment, then did something that surprised her. He leaned in and kissed her, a quick but intense kiss that left Abigail breathless. "Be careful," he muttered before disappearing into the darkness. Abigail walked home along the longest road, her mind a storm of emotions and thoughts. Jessie's kiss still burned on her lips, but it was the weight of the documents in her pocket that worried her most. Those papers were both a death sentence and a possible salvation. The next morning, while watching her students studying, Abigail made a decision. I couldn't continue living in fear, always looking over my shoulder. It was time to face his past head-on. After class, he wrote 2 letters. One for Sheriff Henderson, containing the whole truth about Charles's death and the Worthington scheme. The other to Mrs. Murphy, thanking her for her kindness and asking her to look after the school in her absence. If something went wrong with her meeting with Jessie, at least the truth wouldn't die with her. Redemption Creek had taught him that sometimes redemption only comes through sacrifice. The sun was setting on the horizon, painting the sky with shades of red that resembled blood. Somewhere in the approaching night, Jesse Mason waited for her, carrying his own demons and hopes. Together, perhaps, they could find a way through the darkness that surrounded them. But first, they would have to survive the night to come. The night before meeting Jesse at the creek was the longest of Abigail's life. His hands shook as he packed the documents found among William Mason's belongings into his leather bag. The 2 letters he had written, one to Sheriff Henderson and one to Mrs. Murphy, weighed in his pocket like lead. The setting sun brought with it a restlessness that seemed to infect all of Redemption Creek. Pinkerton detectives had spent the day questioning residents, their presence causing a tense silence on the normally busy streets. Abigail watched from the window of her home as Daniel Preston, the detective she had met in Boston, entered the sheriff's office. "Miss Mason?" A soft knock on her door startled her. It was Mary Henderson carrying a basket covered with a checkered cloth. "Mary, what are you doing here so late?" "Mommy sent you this pie," the girl replied, her blue eyes shining with concern. "She said you looked pale at school today." Abigail felt a lump in her throat. Mary's innocence, her genuine kindness, made what she was about to do even more difficult. "Thank your mother for me," she said, hugging the girl briefly. "Now go home. It's getting dark." After Mary left, Abigail prepared for her night journey. She wore riding breeches under her dress, a precaution she had learned from her previous escapes. She put her small pistol in her coat pocket and tied her hair into a tight braid. The church clock struck 11 when she finally mounted her horse. The full moon illuminated the path, casting elongated shadows that seemed to dance in the wind. The creek where William Mason was killed was half an hour's ride away through rough, exposed terrain. As she rode, Abigail couldn't help but think about how her life had changed since that stormy night in Jesse's cabin. Every decision, every moment of weakness or courage had led her to this point. Now, there was no turning back. The sound of running water announced your arrival at the creek. The spot where William Mason was found was still marked by a makeshift cross, around which someone had placed wildflowers. Abigail dismounted, tying her horse to a nearby tree. "You came." Jesse's voice emerged from the shadows, making her start. "I brought the documents," she replied, her hand instinctively reaching for her bag. Jesse approached his moonlit face, revealing new lines of worry. "I discovered more. James and Robert aren't just working with the Pinkertons, they were part of the Worthington scheme from the beginning. Like this. William discovered that my brothers were helping to transport illegal money through the routes we used for our heists," Jesse explained. "Worthington Bank was using gangs like ours to mask their operations." Abigail felt her stomach drop. "So, Charles, he must have found out about this in Boston." "And he paid with his life, just like William," added Jesse. "But there's something that doesn't make sense. Why would the Pinkertons be looking for you now?" Before Abigail could respond, a twig snapped nearby. Jesse immediately pulled her behind a large rock, his hand covering her mouth to muffle any sound. Voices approached. One of them belonged to Daniel Preston. "The teacher is the key," he said. She has evidence that could destroy the entire operation. Old Man Worthington wants her and the documents eliminated before anyone else discovers the truth. What about Mason? It was the voice of James Jesse's brother. He's a bonus. Kill him when you find him. Abigail's heart was beating so loudly, she was afraid they might hear it. Jesse held her tightly against his chest, his breathing controlled despite the danger. When the voices finally faded away, he released her gently. We need to get out of here. Now. Where to? She whispered. I know a safe place in the mountains. We can. A shot cut through the night, the bullet ricocheting off the rock behind them. Robert Mason emerged from the darkness, his revolver pointed at the couple. You've always been the most sentimental in the family, Jesse, he said with a cruel smile. I knew a woman would. End up cheating on you. Jesse pushed Abigail behind him. She has nothing to do with this, Robert. It's between us. On the contrary, brother, she has everything to do with it. Robert took a few steps forward. Hand over the documents, Madam Professor, and I promise to do it quickly. Time seemed to slow down. Abigail saw Jesse move his hand toward his revolver, saw Robert squeeze the trigger. Without thinking, she drew her own pistol and fired. The sound of the shot echoed through the valley, followed by the thud of Robert's body falling. A dead silence descended over the stream, broken only by the murmur of running water. Abigail! Jesse turned to her, his eyes wide with surprise and concern. It's not the first time I've shot someone, she said, her voice shaking. Charles, he didn't fall down the stairs. He tried to kill me when I found out the truth about the bank scheme. I shot him. Jesse took her in his arms as she began to sob. It's okay, he murmured. It's okay now. More voices were approaching. The sound of the shot had certainly alerted the others. Jesse took Abigail's hand, pulling her toward the horses. Let's go, he said. We still have a chance to do the right thing. We can take these documents to the territorial governor, expose the whole truth. Abigail looked one last time at Robert's body at the cross that marked the place where William had died, at the stream that continued its course indifferent to the human tragedy on its banks. Together, she replied, squeezing Jesse's hand. They quickly mounted and galloped away, leaving Redemption Creek and its deadly secrets behind. The moon watched them, the only witness to their escape, and the silent promise of redemption they shared. The night was long, and the path ahead was uncertain. But for the first time since arriving west, Abigail felt like she was riding toward freedom, not running away from it. The night ride through the wilderness tested Abigail and Jesse's limits. The full moon lit their path as they left Robert Mason's body, and the complications at Redemption Creek behind. The sound of their horses' hooves echoed against the rocks, mixing with the distant howl of coyotes. We need to stop, Jesse said after a few hours. The horses are exhausted, and you are shaking. Abigail hadn't realized she was shivering partly from the cold of the night, partly from the adrenaline of the confrontation with Robert still coursing through her veins. He agreed silently, allowing Jesse to guide them to a small natural cave in the rocky slopes. I used to use this place as a hideout, he explained, helping her dismount. No one other than the Masons know its location. And now there's only you left, Abigail murmured, the reality of the situation finally hitting her. I'm sorry about Robert. Jesse lit a small fire, shadows dancing across his scarred face. Robert made his choices, just like William, just like me. He turned to her, his eyes reflecting the flames. But you, why didn't you tell me the truth about Charles from the beginning? Abigail approached the fire, seeking warmth. Because for so long I tried to convince myself that it was an accident. It was easier to believe that he had fallen down the stairs than to admit that I pulled the trigger. What exactly did he find out about the bank's scheme? Documents that proved that Benjamin Worthington was using the bank to launder money from illegal operations throughout the territory, she replied, taking the papers out of her purse. Charles planned to use this information to take control of the bank, but when I found out, when I threatened to expose everything, he tried to silence her permanently. Jesse added, his voice thick with bitterness. Just like the Masons did to William when he threatened to expose the connection between the gangs and the banks, Abigail added. It's all part of the same corrupt scheme. A noise outside the cave made them freeze. Jesse drew his revolver, moving silently to the entrance. Moments later, he visibly relaxed. Just a deer, he said, but remained vigilant. James and the Pinkertons must be looking for us. We need to leave at dawn. Where to? Carson City? The governor of the territory has a house there. If we can get these documents directly to him, not even Benjamin Worthington can cover up the truth. Abigail nodded, but a new worry appeared in her mind. So, what happens to us? Jesse sat next to her so close she could feel the heat of his body. That's up to you, he said softly. We can go our separate ways, start new lives in different places. Or we can face whatever comes together, he added, his eyes meeting hers. I'm not the same man I was when you slept in my cabin that night. You've changed something in me, Abigail. She reached out, gently touching the scar on his face. I'm also no longer the same woman who ran away in terror in the morning, she whispered. Maybe that's what redemption means. Not erasing the past, but learning from it, growing through it. Jesse leaned in, his lips meeting hers in a kiss different from the first, no longer urgent and desperate, but deep and full of promise. When they separated, Abigail noticed that tears were running down her face. What is it? He asked, worried. I'm tired of running away, she admitted, of being afraid, of carrying this weight alone. You're not alone anymore, Jesse promised, wrapping her in his arms. Never again. They spent the rest of the night planning their journey to Carson City, studying documents by firelight. The evidence was devastating not just for the Worthington Bank, but for an entire system of corruption that stretched from east to west. Look at this, Abigail said, pointing to a list of names. Judges, politicians, even some sheriffs, all getting regular pay. That's why William was killed, Jesse concluded. He didn't just want blackmail, he wanted to expose the whole scheme. The distant sound of hooves alerted them again. This time, it wasn't a deer. Jesse quickly put out the fire while Abigail put away the documents. 3 nights, he whispered, peering through the cave entrance. James is with them. Abigail drew her pistol, a surprising calm washing over her. I won't let them finish you off like they did William. Jesse turned, to her a sad smile on his lips. I never thought I would find someone willing to fight by my side. I never thought I'd find someone worth fighting for, she replied. The nights passed by without noticing the cave, but they both knew it was only a matter of time before they were discovered. Dawn was near, and with it would come the need to continue their journey, a journey that could end in redemption or destruction. Carson City is 3 days' ride away, Jesse said, preparing to leave, through Apache territory. The Indians are not our biggest problem now, replied Abigail, mounting her horse. James knows these paths as well as you do. But you don't know my heart like you do, he said, mounting beside her. And for the first time in my life, I have something worth living for. The rising sun painted the horizon red as they left the cave riding west. Ahead, The mountains stood like silent sentinels guarding secrets and promises of an uncertain future. In their hearts, both Abigail and Jessie knew there was no going back. The past that haunted them and the future they longed for were about to collide, and only the truth, and perhaps love, could save them. The third day of riding brought with it a sky full of dark clouds. Jessie and Abigail had kept a steady pace toward Carson City, alternating between hidden trails and deep valleys to avoid detection. The documents they carried sat like lead on their consciences, each page proof of the corruption that stretched, from the dusty streets of Redemption Creek to the plush offices of Boston. Storm approaching. Jessie observed his experienced eyes scanning the horizon. We need to find shelter before it catches us off guard. Abigail nodded wryly, remembering the night it all began. Another storm, another makeshift shelter. How his life had changed since then. The frightened young teacher who had fled Jessie's cabin in the morning now seemed like a completely different person. There's an old abandoned mission a few miles from here, Jessie said, adjusting the reins. The Apache consider it sacred land. Not even James would risk following us there. As they rode, Abigail noticed Jessie becoming more and more tense, his eyes constantly scanning his surroundings. What is it? She asked. Hoof prints, he replied in a low voice. 3 horses, maybe 4. They passed by here a few hours ago. A distant thunder echoed among the mountains, as if announcing the danger that awaited them. They quickened their pace, the horses panting with the effort of the steep climb that led to the old mission. The building appeared before them like a ghost of adobe and wood. Twisted crosses still stood against the stormy sky, and old faded paintings decorated the peeling walls. Jessie dismounted, first his hand never leaving the handle of the revolver. Something's wrong, he muttered, examining the ground near the entrance. Fresh footprints. Before they could react, a familiar voice cut through the air. Welcome to the house of God, little brother. James Mason emerged from the shadows of the mission, followed by Daniel Preston and another Pinkerton detective. Everyone held weapons. How? Jessie asked, instinctively, positioning himself between the men and Abigail. You've always been predictable, Jessie, James replied with a cruel smile. I knew I would look for the mission during the storm. Some habits never change. The documents, Miss Mason, Preston demanded, stepping forward. Hand them over now, and perhaps we can negotiate your survival. Abigail felt the weight of the pistol on her dress. Her hands no longer shook at the thought of using it. After killing Robert, something had changed inside her. How did you negotiate Charles's survival? He asked bitterly. Charles was weak, Preston replied. Just like your father is weak. Benjamin Worthington doesn't understand that sometimes you have to get your hands dirty to keep your empire running. A flash of lightning illuminated the scene, followed immediately by a deafening thunder. The first drops of rain began to fall heavy and cold. It's your last chance, James warned, his revolver pointed at Jessie's chest. The documents, or you two die right here. It was then that Abigail did something unexpected. She laughed. A bitter laugh filled with all the fears and secrets he had carried for so long. Do you really think I would keep the original documents with me? His statement caused a moment of hesitation among the men. Jessie, understanding his bluff, took advantage of the distraction to draw his gun. Chaos ensued in the old mission. Shots echoed against the adobe walls, mixing with the thunder of the storm that was now raging in full force. Abigail and Jessie split up, seeking cover among the ancient columns. James and the Pinkertons did the same, turning the sacred site into a battlefield. The documents were sent to the governor yesterday, Abigail shouted between the shots. By an Apache messenger. It was a lie, of course. The papers were still safe in her bag. But the planted doubt had the desired effect. Preston and the other detective exchanged worried looks, their confidence shaken. "She lies!" James roared, advancing towards the column where Jesse took shelter. "I know my brother. He would never trust Indians." "You don't know me anymore, James," Jesse replied, emerging from the shadows to face his brother. "Not after what they did to William." The Mason brothers stared at each other through the rain falling between them, years of rivalry and betrayal reaching their defining moment. Abigail saw James's finger press the trigger and acted on instinct. His shot hit James in the shoulder, causing him to stagger. At the same moment, Jesse hit Preston in the chest. The third detective, seeing his fallen comrades, fled into the stormy night. "It's over, James," Jesse said, approaching his injured brother. "William died trying to do the right thing. Now it's our turn." James laughed, blood staining his lips. "Nothing is over, little brother. The Worthington Empire has long arms. You will never reach Carson City." "We're here," Abigail replied, her voice firm. "The documents we carry are just copies. The originals are already with the authorities." It was another lie, but this time there was enough conviction in her voice to make James pale. The sound of approaching hooves made everyone turn towards the mission entrance. "The Territorial Patrol," James muttered, recognizing the uniforms through the rain. "Did you guys plan this?" "No," Jesse replied, a smile appearing on his lips. "But maybe it's a sign that God still cares about this old mission, after all." The next few hours passed in a blur. James and Preston were arrested, their confessions extracted by the prospect of hanging. The documents, the real ones, were handed over to the patrol captain, an honest man who personally promised to take them to the governor. When the storm finally subsided, Abigail and Jesse remained at the abandoned mission, watching the sun rise through the dissipating clouds. "What happens now?" she asked, her hand finding his. "Now," Jesse replied, pulling her close, "we begin again, together." The former mission, which had witnessed so much violence the night before, now seemed to bless their union with the sacred silence of the morning. The surrounding mountains stood as silent guardians of their secrets and promises. The Maui journey was not over. There was still a corrupt empire to dismantle, truths to reveal. But for the first time since their paths crossed that stormy night at Redemption Creek, both Abigail and Jesse felt that redemption was not just a distant possibility, but a promise they could finally fulfill. News of the arrest of James Mason and Daniel Preston spread like dry prairie fire. Within days, the story of the Worthington Bank corruption scheme and its connection to Western gangs had reached the territory's major newspapers. The empire that Benjamin Worthington had built was beginning to crumble stone by stone. For Abigail and Jesse, however, victory was bittersweet. The Territorial Patrol kept them under protection in Carson City, housed in separate rooms in a modest boarding house near the governor's palace. Physical proximity did not lessen the emotional distance that recent events had created. "Depositions begin tomorrow," said Captain Lawrence, patrol leader, during a tense meeting in the boarding house's common room. "The governor wants to hear your stories personally before taking any action against Worthington Bank." Abigail watched the rain outside the window, her thoughts returning to the school at Redemption Creek, to her students, to the life she had built and lost in such a short time. "And then?" she asked, her voice carrying a tiredness that went beyond the physical. "Afterwards," the captain replied. "It will depend on the governor. Mason here is still a wanted outlaw, regardless of his recent actions." Jesse, who had remained silent throughout the conversation, finally spoke up. "What about Abigail? She needs protection." Benjamin Worthington will not simply accept the destruction of his empire. We've already arranged that, Lawrence assured. Miss Mason will be transferred to San Francisco as soon as the depositions are over. New identity, new life. The words fell like stones into the silence of the room. Abigail felt her heart sink. San Francisco meant another fresh start, another escape. But this time the idea of leaving alone seemed unbearable. When the captain left, Jesse approached her for the first time since they arrived in Carson City. "San Francisco," he murmured, as if testing the taste of the words. "It's a good city to start over. To start over alone," she added still, without looking at him. "Like always." "Abigail," his voice carried a plea she had never heard before. "Look at me." She turned, finding the same whirlwind of emotions she felt in his eyes. "I can't." "Ask you to come with me, Jesse. Not when you finally have a chance to clear your name." "My name?" He laughed humorlessly. "What's a clean name if I don't have you by my side? Everything I've done since that night in the cabin has been for you." "And everything I did was for justice," she replied, the tears finally escaping. "For Charles, for William, for everyone who died because of the Worthingtons' greed. I can't let go of this now." A knock on the door interrupted the moment. It was Mary Henderson, accompanied by her mother. The girl ran to hug Abigail, while Mrs. Murphy watched the scene with teary eyes. "We came as soon as we heard," Mrs. Murphy explained. "Redemption Creek isn't the same without you, sweetheart." How's school?" Abigail asked, trying to maintain her composure. "The children miss you," Mary replied, her eyes shining. "But Dad said you're doing something important, something brave." Jesse watched the interaction with a contemplative expression. The presence of the girl and her mother seemed to have brought back some of the Abigail he had known, the dedicated teacher, the woman who believed in the possibility of change. That night, after the visitors left, Jesse found Abigail in the small garden of the guest house. The air was thick with the scent of night flowers, and the stars shone with a clarity that seemed to mock the confusion in their hearts. "I have a proposal," he said, sitting next to her on the wooden bench. "What if we didn't run away?" Abigail looked at him confused. "What do you mean?" "What if, for the first time in our lives, we stopped running away? What if we faced all of this together, right here?" The governor needs us," Jesse interrupted. "You need our testimonies, our cooperation to dismantle not just the Worthington Bank, but the entire corrupt system it represents. Are you suggesting we stay and fight? I'm suggesting we do the right thing the right way for once." He took your hands in his. "No more running away in the middle of the night. No more false identities. Just the truth, no matter how painful it is." Abigail felt something shift within her, a resolve that had been dormant since Charles's death. "And then, when it's all over." "Later," Jesse replied with a soft smile, "we'll go back to Redemption Creek. The school needs its teacher, and well, maybe it's time for an outlaw to learn to read properly." The laugh that escaped Abigail's lips was genuine, the first in weeks. "Are you telling me you want to be my student, Mr. Mason?" "I'm saying I want to be your partner in every way possible." The kiss they shared was different from the ones before, no longer desperate or urgent, but full of promise and determination. When they separated, Abigail saw in Jesse's eyes a reflection of her own resolve. The next morning, when they entered the deposition room of the governor's palace together, they were no longer fugitives seeking redemption. They were partners united not only by the love they discovered in the midst of chaos, but by the determination to make a difference in the world they had chosen to face together. The Carson City sun shone through the tall windows, illuminating the path ahead, a path that for the first time led not away, but home. Autumn had arrived at Redemption Creek when Abigail and Jesse returned. The trees' golden leaves danced in the gentle breeze, and the air carried that peculiar mix of dust and promise that only the American West could produce. 3 months had passed since the depositions in Carson City, where the truth about the Worthington empire finally came to light. Benjamin Worthington had been arrested, along with dozens of corrupt officials and dishonest bankers. The surviving Mason brothers, James, and the third detective Pinkerton, who had escaped, were captured trying to cross the border into Mexico. Justice, slow but inexorable, had finally caught up with those who had so long considered themselves above it. "It looks different," Jesse observed, leading his horse alongside Abigail's down the main street. "More live." He was right. Redemption Creek had changed during his absence. New buildings were rising where there had previously been only empty lots, and the bustle in the streets suggested a newfound prosperity. But it was the residents' looks that surprised the most. There was no longer fear or distrust, just a curious mix of respect and acceptance. "Miss Mason, Mr. Mason!" Mary Henderson's excited voice cut through the morning air. The girl was running towards him, her golden braids blowing in the wind. "You guys are back." Abigail dismounted to hug her former student, feeling tears of joy form in her eyes. "Yes, sweetheart. We're back to stay." Sheriff Henderson approached more calmly, a genuine smile on his weathered face. "Welcome back. The school is waiting for you, Abigail. And as for you, Jesse." He held out something that glittered in the sun, a deputy's badge. Considering his assistance in dismantling the territory's largest criminal operation, the governor felt it appropriate to offer an official position. Jesse looked at the badge with a mixture of surprise and suppressed emotion. "I don't know if I deserve it, Sheriff." "Redemption is not about earning it," Henderson responded. "It's about choosing to do the right thing no matter the cost. You and Abigail have proven that." News of his return spread quickly. At dusk, Mrs. Murphy organized a small celebration. At the local saloon, no longer a den of violence, but a family establishment under its new management. The piano played softly as residents gathered to hear the full story of events in Carson City. "And what happened to the original documents?" asked someone in the crowd. "They're safe in the governor's archives," Abigail replied, "along with our sworn statements and the Mason brothers' confessions." "What about Charles?" Mrs. Murphy asked gently. "Your family in Boston." "You finally know the truth," completed Abigail, feeling Jesse's hand squeeze hers under the table. "It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Sometimes the only way to move forward is to face the past head-on." As the night progressed, the guests left, leaving only the new couple with their thoughts and plans for the future. Jesse led Abigail out of the saloon, where the starry sky stretched endlessly over Redemption Creek. "You know," he said, stopping, "under the school's porch. I never imagined I would find peace here. I always thought my life would be a constant escape." Abigail smiled, touching the scar on her face, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "And I never imagined I would find love in the midst of chaos. Funny how life surprises us. Speaking of surprises," Jesse took something out of his vest pocket, a small ring with a blue stone. "I found this among William's things. It was our mother's. He always said it should go to the right woman when we found redemption." Abigail felt her heart quicken as Jesse knelt before her right there under the stars that had witnessed so much of their journey. "Abigail Mason," he said, his voice carrying all the weight and all the hope of their intertwined stories. "You taught me that even the worst nightmares can turn into dreams. That redemption is not a destiny, but a daily choice. Would you marry me, not because we need each other to survive, but because we choose to live this life together? Tears were flowing freely down her face now. Yes, he replied simply, because some truths don't need many words. The ring slid perfectly onto her finger, as if it had been destined to be there from the beginning. On the horizon, the first ray of sunlight was beginning to paint the sky pink and gold, a new day dawning over Redemption Creek. Weeks later, it was at the same school where it all started that they exchanged their vows. Mary Henderson was the flower girl carrying a bouquet of desert lilies, the same flowers that Jessie had left for Abigail that night of confessions and promises. The entire city turned out, transforming the simple ceremony into a celebration of life and love that can flourish even in the most unlikely places. Sheriff Henderson led the ceremony, his words echoing the truth everyone there had learned. Sometimes we need to lose ourselves completely to find our true path. Redemption Creek isn't just a name, it's a promise that no matter how dark the night dawn, always brings with it the chance to begin again. Jessie and Abigail built their home on the outskirts of town, not far from the old cabin where their paths first crossed. In the mornings, she continues teaching at the school now, with Jessie occasionally sitting among the students, fulfilling his promise to learn to read properly. In the afternoon, he patrols the city's borders as a deputy maintaining the peace that took so much to achieve. And in the evenings, when the sun sets over the western plains, they sit on their porch watching the stars and telling stories no longer of escape and fear, but of love, courage, and the extraordinary journey that brought them here. Because in Redemption Creek, just like in their hearts, redemption has never been about erasing the past, but about transforming it into something beautiful and meaningful. A constant reminder that sometimes the greatest treasures are found in the unlikeliest of places, and that true love doesn't just survive the storms, it blooms through them.